Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and one of the questions I get all the time from people who see a various program I might be talking about online, and I'll say, look, this program here was intended to get best results for naturals, things like that, and I'll say that because of whatever reason, that it's a little bit more geared towards people who aren't using anything, and they'll probably get better results using certain types of training than others, in terms of overall muscle gain. We're not even getting into strength and athleticism or any of that. And people will invariably ask, well, what happens if I run this program as an enhanced lifter? Will it be okay? Will it still work? And when you think about that, it's almost a ludicrous question. And when I talk about this, guys, I'm not even endorsing this. I'm not telling anyone that they should go out and do gear or any of that. I'm not going to get into any of that. This is not an endorsement of that in this video. This is just being objective and having people sit back and look at the data, look at the evidence before they ask a question like that. And the problem with that is that the whole online community has given us a lot of information over the years that, look, we know most of the famous people out there use stuff. Therefore, the way that they train is more geared towards that, but it gives people the impression that if they train a certain way on gear, that they'll get better gains from the gear than if they trained how they would have when natural. And that's not necessarily true. This doesn't work both directions. It doesn't work both directions. And the reality is what it really does, and I'll explain why in a second, is that it just gives you more wiggle room. In other words, people who use stuff have a much, much, much larger margin for error in the way that they train compared to the maximum amount of muscle mass they're going to gain. In other words, if you're natural, there's only a handful of ways you can probably train and still ensure that you're stimulating maximum muscle growth per month in, say, a given part of your body. All right, there's only so many ways you can do that and still stimulate maximum growth. You don't have a lot of options. You do, but you don't. Because again, you've got to pay more attention to maximum volume, recoverable volume, frequency. Frequency starts to become more important. How much volume you can actually adapt to and recover from. You have you have a fairly small margin of error that you can get away with and still grow. Whereas as people start to add things to their body that cause growth without training, that speed up recovery, that increase work capacity, it should make sense as these things just don't matter as much. I'm not saying they don't matter at all, but they matter a lot less. That's the reason you see so many really enormous bodybuilders who have oftentimes contradictory training styles and philosophies. They will actually say, this is what gave me my results, and another one will be the same size and have something that completely contradicts that in the way that he trains in his philosophy, and they both got there. And it's not because everyone is different. Some people are more different than others because they put more stuff in their body that lets them get away with whatever they want. Now, and to understand this, let's look at this in a different way. All the data I've looked at suggests to me, other than like one study, and I don't hold that in much regard, has shown that gear, or whatever we want to call it, produces muscle growth even in people who don't train. You guys can argue about that all day long. There have been multiple studies conducted under controlled circumstances in which people were not allowed to exercise who had previously been lifting, and they gained very significant amounts of muscle. In other words, it has a growth stimulation at the cellular level that is completely independent of your training. I don't believe they create a synergy. A lot of people are like, well, and for those who don't understand synergy, that's the idea that you can add two things together and the sum will be greater than the individual parts. In other words, 2 + 2 can equal 5 in a synergistic relationship. I believe that this is 2 + 2 only equals 4. In other words, I think that the growth that someone stimulates from training is a certain amount. And I think that these anabolic substances add a certain amount, and I don't think you gain anything further beyond that by the combination of the two. In other words, if the substances were going to make you gain 3 pounds of muscle in a month, and the training, had you done the same training completely natty, you would have gained 1 pound of muscle a month. I think you're only going to gain 4 pounds of muscle that month. And I'm just throwing random numbers out there. But you're not going to gain 5 or 6 from it. And if you didn't do the training at all, you would have still gained the 3. I think that really is how it works, and everything I've seen in my life, evidence in the real world from 2 decades of observing this, from studies I've seen, I think that really is the case. So that being said, we know, based upon studies, that even people who don't train at all gain muscle on these things in a dose-dependent relationship. In other words, In other words, someone who uses 250 milligrams of whatever will probably gain more muscle than someone who's completely natural and clean. All right? Someone who's using 500 will gain more than both of them. They'll gain a little more than the 250. Someone who uses 1,000 will gain more than the 500 by a small amount. It seems to be about a 40 to 50% increase each time the amount is doubled. All right, in terms of what they gain per month of overall muscle mass. So far, that's what the studies seem to indicate. So when you use that logic and you extrapolate that, and you look at a given training program, if a training program for a natural produces really good results, why wouldn't it produce really good results on someone who chooses to go enhanced also? If that program is capable of taking a natural person and giving them really strong, solid muscle mass and strength gains, why wouldn't the same person gain more muscle while doing it while they're taking gear of some type? Why wouldn't they? There's no logical reason this is, oh, no, that program only works for people who are naturals. It's stimulating nearly maximum growth in someone who's completely clean. And then if someone throws substances on it that make people gain muscle who don't even train at all, and that has been proven, that is not an arguable point. Sorry, it's not arguable. There's large amounts of data proving it repeatedly in the lab. You can argue it till you're blue in the face. So why wouldn't they gain even more muscle than the natty would? What world does someone live in where they wouldn't think that? And I think the confusion comes in because, again, you go back to the other thing of you see people who use significant amounts of exogenous hormones who are really big. They carry a lot of muscle, but their training is really oftentimes not very good. They might be doing a routine to where they're in the gym 5 days a week. They have a chest day, a back day, a shoulder day, a leg day, and an arm day. And they come in and they do 20 sets of a bunch of high rep stuff with very little big heavy compounds. Maybe 3 sets of a big heavy compound or whatever. And then they do a bunch of cable and machine exercises and everything after that for large volumes, like 18 or 20 sets, right? That's not uncommon. A person who's completely natural who does that, especially if they're not a complete novice, because a novice will grow from anything. A novice will gain a little bit of muscle from doing jumping jacks, actually, just doing some jumping jacks. A novice who's been completely sedentary will gain a little muscle from going out and mowing grass for 20 minutes every day with a lawnmower they push. They'll gain muscle from that. So just so you understand that. But you put a natty on that routine, and they only gain sometimes half the muscle they would have been gaining on a better routine. So people then get the idea, well, the big guy uses that routine because it must produce much better results for people who are on stuff. No, not necessarily. He's getting fantastic results because he's training and he's on stuff. And that what people need to remember, the biggest problem you run into with a program like that is maximum recoverable volume. In other words, if you're coming in doing 20 sets of a bunch of things, your biceps or your pecs or whatever might be spending the majority of your growth window recovering from that much volume, because they're only going to grow for about 48 hours, right? Maximum workload workout will cause up to about 48 hours of muscle growth, or a window in which the muscle is capable of growing, and then it stops growing again. If you don't re-stimulate that muscle after 48 hours, in some manner, it stops growing. That's pretty well documented in the literature. Well, the problem is if they're doing 20 sets, they might be spending 30 hours of that 48-hour growth window recovering, and the muscle's still not adapting or growing. So they end up having a much smaller growth window because they did so much useless volume and traumatized the muscle so much that it's still spending time recovering during the relatively small growth window, and then they only train the muscle again a week later. So it ends up having a lot of volume that stimulated a lot of growth, but not enough adaptation and recovery time following it, and then waiting a long time to re-stimulate it again. All right, they don't gain as much muscle as they could be. They'll still gain some muscle. They'll gain some muscle, of course they will. They won't gain as much. Whereas in the person on a bunch of substances, their recovery from that workout might happen in 8 hours instead of 30. Therefore, they get a much bigger growth window from it, And then in addition, they have all that other stuff making them grow even if they hadn't trained. So they get away with it and they don't see much difference from it. In other words, they don't gain any more or less, at least in a measurable amount, less muscle than they would have had they followed a really good routine for a natural. And they happen to enjoy training that way, and that's a tradition now in the bodybuilding world, so guys just train that way. It doesn't mean it's more effective, it just means they have a massive margin for error because they recover faster, they grow longer, they grow more no matter what they do on any program. So the way that they choose to train starts to matter a lot less. As long as they're training, they're gaining a little extra muscle on top of what the substances are giving them. So hopefully that makes sense. But at the end of the day, you need to understand that if a program works really well for naturals, it's obviously going to work better for people who use stuff. Doesn't matter what the program is. Any program that a natural gains any muscle on, somebody who's putting exogenous gear into their body is going to gain more muscle. Period. Full stop. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.